Okay. Have you ever been scrolling through social media
Yeah.
and then suddenly, bam, you feel like you need to buy something you didn't even know existed 2 minutes ago?
Ah, yes. The subtle power of a well-crafted marketing campaign.
Exactly. It's like those shoes, right? That every influencer and their dog seems to be wearing, and then you realize you have to have them too.
Yeah.
And that's what this deep dive is all about. We're talking about how public relations shapes our world often without us even realizing it.
Mm-hmm.
And to guide us through this very fascinating, very shadowy landscape, we're going back to the OG of PR himself, Edward Bernays,
The father of PR, that's right.
and his groundbreaking, maybe even infamous, 1928 book, Propaganda.
Which, by the way, was a pretty bold move for the time, using that word, propaganda.
Right.
Still had all that, wartime baggage.
A loaded word.
Yeah.
Yeah. Post-World War I, when manipulating the masses, it was like a necessary evil, but still evil. So
It was a different era. Propaganda was, fresh from its use in World War One. And Bernays, being Sigmund Freud's nephew, was fascinated by this idea of mass psychology, but he wanted to kind of like rebrand propaganda as a tool for peacetime.
right, less Uncle Sam wants you and more like, you absolutely need this new brand of cigarettes.
Well, we'll circle back to the cigarettes a bit later.
Okay.
But you're hitting on a really crucial point, which is that Bernays argued that propaganda, or as he preferred to call it, public relations, was in itself not good or bad. It's a tool. And like any tool, it could be used to build or destroy, right?
So how did Bernays think that this tool worked? How did it do what it did?
Well, he argued that to really understand society, we need to look beyond individuals and understand this complex web of groups and influences that shape our choices. And he called this idea organizing chaos.
Organizing chaos.
Think about it. I mean, you're part of countless groups, right? Whether it's your online communities, professional circles, your group of friends, each of those has its own set of beliefs and opinions.
Absolutely. And my social media feeds are a testament to that.
Yeah.
I mean, 1 minute it's cat videos, the next it's like heated political debates.
Yeah.
It's a jungle in there.
It is. And Bernays saw this brewing back then, and he uses these almost comical examples in the book. I mean, he lists associations like the National Nut News and the Anti-Profanity League alongside, these very serious professional groups. The point he's making is everyone's part of some niche group, all vying for attention and all ripe for influence.
So less about controlling individuals and more about understanding and then kind of like leveraging these group dynamics. Like if you can tap into the right group, you can set off a chain reaction.
Exactly. Bernays believed that a new type of propagandist had emerged, someone who wasn't just selling products, but almost engineering consent by appealing to the desires and aspirations of these groups.
Okay, how do you engineer consent?
Well, take fashion trends, for example. Bernays argues that something as seemingly random as whether velvet or silk shoes are in this season, right, could be strategically orchestrated.
Right.
Designers, influencers, even royalty could be enlisted to create this like must-have aura around a certain style, right?
So it's not about the shoes themselves, it's the feeling, the idea that they represent. Like, if I'm wearing those shoes, then I'm part of this cool club.
Exactly. And that desire to belong, to fit in, it's a very powerful motivator. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Bernays argued that this doesn't just apply to, clothes, but to ideas, beliefs, to anything that's associated with a particular group identity.
So you're telling me those which Harry Potter house are you quizzes, they weren't just harmless fun. They were shaping my entire worldview.
Well, maybe not your entire worldview, but...
Okay. I'm mostly kidding, but I see your point here. It's that, Bernays really tapped into this power of psychology before it was even a thing, before it was trendy. But he didn't just talk about it, right? He put these ideas into action.
He did. And one of the most fascinating and frankly audacious examples involves the bacon industry.
The bacon industry.
So they wanted to increase sales, right? But instead of simply telling people to eat more bacon, which seems pretty logical.
Yeah, that's what I would have gone with. But again, not a PR mastermind.
Right, exactly. So Bernays, understanding psychology, knew that to change eating habits, you needed to target the influencers, right? And who did people trust most about health back then?
They're doctors.
Exactly. Bernays convinced doctors to start recommending a hearty breakfast of bacon and eggs.
Wait, are you serious?
Oh, yeah.
So my doctor's obsession with protein at breakfast is Edward Bernays' fault.
It might be. It might be. So his campaign was based on this then revolutionary idea that a protein-rich breakfast was healthier than a lighter one.
Okay.
Whether or not that's true is a whole other deep dive.
That is a rabbit hole. I am here for it. But let's get back to Bernays, back to bacon. So he's essentially saying find those pressure points, right? The doctors, the fashion icons, those tastemakers, and you can sway entire populations.
Essentially, yeah. He called these influencers invisible governors.
Invisible governors,
Yeah, yeah.
shaping our desires, pulling the strings of society. I'm starting to see the whole invisible government thing now.
hmm And he argued that to really thrive in this new landscape, businesses, politicians, social movements, everyone needed to understand and harness this power of public perception.
So it's not enough to have a great product or a worthy cause. You have to know how to sell it, how to create that buzz.
Precisely. And Bernays had some very specific ideas about how to do that. He even coined terms like high spouting and continuous interpretation to describe these strategies.
Okay, I'm loving these like vintage PR terms given to me. What is high spotting?
So imagine this. You build a skyscraper, right?
Okay,
But you don't want just any skyscraper. You want the tallest one in the world.
because why be second best?
Exactly. And Bernays uses that example, right, of making a building just a few feet taller than the previous record holder because it guarantees headlines. It's about creating a spectacle, an event, something that grabs the public's attention.
So that time Red Bull had someone jump from space, that was high spotting.
100%. It's about getting your message to stand out from all the noise,
Yeah.
even if it means doing something kind of, outrageous.
Okay, I got it. But what about continuous interpretation? That one sounds a little less, I don't know, flashy.
It is. Continuous interpretation is more about consistently shaping the narrative around your brand or your cause. It's about managing every interaction with the public, press releases, customer service, social media, to make sure that your message is getting through.
Less one big publicity stunt, more like a slow, steady drip feed of information.
Exactly. It's about embedding your message in the fabric of how people perceive the world.
Wow. That's both impressive and a little terrifying at the same time. But it's not just businesses using these tactics, though, right? I mean, didn't Bernays also talk about politics as well?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, he considered politics the original big business when it came to using these techniques to sway opinion.
And he didn't always seem impressed with their methods. I vaguely remember him mentioning this one political campaign, and it was hugely inefficient.
Ah,
Yeah.
the one that spent over $15 for every single vote they got.
Yeah.
He was shocked by how much money they wasted compared to a well-run business. And it just highlighted this contrast between like very intuition-based campaigning and then data-driven public relations.
Interesting. For a guy who practically invented modern PR, he really doesn't hold back on those who don't, quite measure up. But politics and businesses weren't his only targets, right? He also saw a role for these ideas in some unexpected places, like, for example, the women's rights movement.
That's right. And this might seem surprising, for 1928, but Bernays recognized this growing influence of women in society, and he argued that they could and should be using these same principles of public relations to advocate for social change.
So for Bernays, this wasn't just about selling products, right? It was about promoting ideas, shaping public discourse. It was about, I don't know, maybe even changing the world.
Precisely. Although, as with any powerful tool, the ethical implications are.
Yeah, the ethics of wielding this much persuasive power. Because you can't really talk about propaganda without talking about that potential for manipulation,
Yeah.
right? It's a real slippery slope, right? It's like 1 minute you're convincing people to have a hearty breakfast, and then the next you're, I don't know, telling them buy into some harmful ideology.
Yeah, and that's the tension that Bernays himself grappled with throughout his career, right? He saw the potential for propaganda, or as he preferred to call it, public relations, to be used for good or for bad.
So how do you reconcile those two things? How do you keep this incredibly powerful tool in check?
Well, Bernays believed that the antidote to manipulation was knowledge, and so he wanted to demystify these techniques or explain how they worked so that people could be more aware of them.
So almost like a magician revealing all their secrets,
Hmm.
but instead of making the magic disappear, it's like everybody's in on the trick.
Exactly, yeah. Bernays believed that by understanding the mechanics of persuasion, people could become more discerning, more critical consumers of the information.
Which is, I mean, that's the whole point of even having this conversation, right? By reading propaganda and talking about it on this deep dive, we're basically inoculating ourselves, right?
It's like a vaccine against bad ideas. The more you understand how persuasion works, the less likely you are to be taken in by it.
But he didn't just want to make people better consumers of information, right? He also had some pretty strong thoughts about how these techniques could be used ethically.
Absolutely. And he argued that businesses, organizations, they had a responsibility to use these tools for good,
Yeah.
to promote transparency, build trust, engage in honest communication with the public.
Which, let's face it, doesn't always happen, right? I mean, we've all seen those companies out there that seem more concerned with spinning a narrative than
Yeah.
actually taking responsibility for their actions.
It's true. And that's why I think Bernays' work is still so relevant today, right? It's a reminder that ethics and responsibility, they're not optional, especially in a world that's so saturated with information.
And speaking of a world saturated with information, what do you think Bernays would make of our current media landscape?
Hmm.
Social media, targeted advertising, the 24-hour news cycle. I mean, this is a completely different beast than what he was dealing with.
It really is. It's mind-boggling, isn't it? Imagine Bernays like scrolling through Twitter for the first time or seeing a perfectly targeted ad pop up on his phone. I think he'd be fascinated and horrified, maybe all at the same time.
It's like his wildest dreams and his worst nightmares just all rolled into one. He dedicated his career to understanding and harnessing the power of PR. Could he have ever imagined this?
It's a double-edged sword, that's for sure, right? I mean, on the one hand, the tools that Bernays wrote about, they've been amplified in ways that he couldn't have possibly imagined. But on the other hand, so has that potential for manipulation, for misinformation.
Yeah, we're living in a Bernaysian world on steroids.
Hmm.
But knowing what we know now, right? How do we navigate this landscape? How do we make sure that we're not just pawns in someone else's PR game?
Well, I think Bernays gives us some clues, and he talks about this importance of critical thinking, of questioning everything, of seeking out diverse perspectives. And remember those invisible governors that he talked about.
Yeah, the influencers, the tastemakers, the people that we trust to kind of guide us.
Right. And Bernays would argue that we need to be aware of who those invisible governors are in our own lives. Who are we listening to? Who are we letting shape our worldview?
It's about taking responsibility for the information that we consume. Not just passively absorbing whatever comes our way,
Right.
but being active, discerning participants in that process.
Exactly. Yeah. We can't just unplug from the matrix, but we can become more aware of how it works, right? How it tries to influence us. And that awareness is that first step to taking back control.
So knowledge is power, right?
Knowledge and perhaps a healthy dose of skepticism as well.
And maybe a good ad blocker while we're at it. But
Oh,
but seriously, this whole idea of critical thinking, of questioning our own assumptions, it feels even more important in the age of social media, doesn't it?
absolutely, because the algorithms, right, they're designed to keep us scrolling, keep us engaged, even if
Okay.
even if that engagement comes at the cost of critical thinking.
Yeah, it's like we're all just stuck in these giant echo chambers, just hearing our own beliefs reflected back to us. How do we break out of that?
It takes conscious effort, right? It means seeking out different viewpoints, even if they make us uncomfortable. It means questioning our own biases, asking ourselves why we believe the things that we believe.
Mhm.
And it means remembering that, just because everyone else is doing something doesn't mean we have to.
It's about thinking for ourselves. What a concept.
So radical, right? But, if Bernays were here today, I think that's exactly what he'd be urging us to do. Think for ourselves, question everything, and never, ever underestimate the power of a well-crafted message.
Yeah, it really makes you think, doesn't it?
Mm.
I mean, on the one hand, you've got these incredible tools for shaping how people see the world, right? But on the other hand, we have this huge responsibility to use them, ethically, which, let's face it, isn't always easy.
It's a tough balance to strike, for sure. But I think that's what makes Bernays' work so fascinating, so relevant. He doesn't shy away from that complexity.
Not at all. He dives right into the deep end with us, exploring how these techniques they play out in every area of life, right? Like we talked about, business, politics, social movement.
Yeah, he even talks about public relations role in education, in the arts, and science.
It's like he's saying, look, no matter what your field is, if you want to make a real impact, you've got to know how to communicate effectively.
Yeah.
You can't just assume people will get it.
Right.
You have to persuade them. And he gives this really fascinating example from the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People,
Okay.
about how they used this very carefully orchestrated conference in Atlanta to try and shift public opinion on racial equality.
Wow. And this was what, the 1920s, right?
That's right, yeah.
So the South was still, grappling with a lot of resistance to racial equality at that time.
Absolutely. And the NAACP, they understood that to change people's hearts and minds, you couldn't just, preach to the choir.
Right. Yeah.
You had to engage with the people who disagreed with you. You need to reach a wider audience, and probably an audience that wasn't necessarily super receptive to their message if it wasn't presented in just the right way.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's where public relations comes in. The NAACP very strategically invited really influential Southern leaders to this conference. They framed the conversation in a way that would resonate with the local community. And they used the power of the press to amplify their message to a national audience.
So it wasn't just about being right? It was about being strategic, understanding who you're talking to, knowing their language, even knowing how to connect with them on an emotional level.
Absolutely. It's about meeting people where they are. And Bernays really, truly recognized that this approach, it wasn't just effective for selling products or winning elections. It could be a powerful, powerful tool for social change.
Which is remarkable, especially considering the time. I mean, we're talking about using these techniques to try to advance civil rights in the Jim Crow South.
It was a bold move, for sure. And it shows that Bernays, for all his, talk about the manipulative power of propaganda, he truly believed that it could also be used for good.
It's about harnessing the power of persuasion to try to create positive change in the world. And that's an inspiring thought, but it's also incredibly daunting. Right? I mean, how do we, as individuals, how do we even begin to measure up to that?
I think it starts with awareness, right? It starts with understanding the techniques that are being used,
Right.
recognizing how they influence, our own beliefs, our own behaviors, and then using that knowledge to make more conscious choices.
So the next time I'm scrolling through Instagram and I see an influencer promoting the next, I don't know, must-have gadget or whatever it is, I should channel my inner Edward Bernays and say, like,
Am I choosing this, or has someone chosen it for me?
and maybe even more importantly, like, who benefits if I do decide to buy into this?
Exactly, yeah. Because there's almost always someone behind the curtain crafting that message, shaping that narrative.
It's about remembering that we're not just these passive consumers of information,
Yeah.
but we're active participants in this conversation that's constantly evolving around us.
And our choices, both big and small, they have the power to shape the world around us.
So knowledge is power. There it is again.
Knowledge, awareness, a healthy dose of critical thinking. Those are the tools that we need to navigate this complex world that we live in.
Well said, well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into the world of Edward Bernays and his really thought-provoking, sometimes unsettling book, Propaganda.
It's a good one.
We covered so much ground today, from, the nitty-gritty of how persuasion actually works to the ethical considerations, that come with wielding that kind of power.
It's a lot.
It is. But I think the most important takeaway here is this. We all have this responsibility to be critical thinkers, to question those messages that we're just bombarded with every single day, and to make conscious, informed choices about who and what we allow to influence us.
Hear, hear.
So next time you're scrolling through your social media feeds, or maybe you're watching a commercial, or hey, you're even listening to a podcast, remember what we talked about today?
Remember Edward Bernays?
Remember those invisible governors, right?
They're out there.
They're everywhere. And never, ever underestimate the power of a well-crafted message.
Well said.
Until next time, everyone, happy deep diving.